Hi, I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater. When we're talking about guitar amplifiers, a common question that comes up is which is better, tube or solid state? I've got both types here, a tube amp as well as a solid state amp, and it can certainly be confusing to sort through the benefits of each type of amplifier. In fact, the question gets even murkier because in modern amps, we also have modeling to consider. There have also been an increasing number of what you might call hybrid amps that combine different technologies together. So let's start our conversation today about tubes versus solid state with some definitions and descriptions of the various technologies involved. In all cases, what we're talking about is taking the very small electrical signal that a guitar pickup puts out and raising its level, or amplifying it, to the point where it's strong enough to drive a speaker. This requires a huge increase in power. To achieve this huge increase in power, amplifiers typically use two stages. The first is a preamp stage, which raises the tiny signal from the guitar pickups to what's called line level. This is the signal level that you might see come out of a studio preamp or compressor or other piece of gear, and similar to the level that most keyboards put out. The preamp stage is where you'd find the gain and volume controls, the different channels, and the tone stack or EQ controls. And it's where the tone of the guitar signal is largely shaped. The second stage of the amplifier is called the power amplifier, and it takes that preamplified signal and dramatically increases its level so that it can cause a speaker to physically move. There typically isn't a lot of tone shaping that goes on in this section, aside from the power amp circuitry, of course, although sometimes you see presence, resonance, and similar controls that actually function inside the power amp section. Between these two stages, the preamp and the power amp sections, is where the effects send and return will be located if your amp has one. Now, the differences come in because designers use different components to build these stages in the amp. In a tube amplifier, typically 12AX7 tubes would be used for the gain and so on in the preamp section. In the power section, you might find 6V6, 6L6, EL84, EL34, KT66, KT88, or other large power tubes doing the heavy lifting. Each of these tube types has a different tonal signature, different distortion characteristics, and different response characteristics, and so on, that contribute to the overall sound quality and feel of the amp. There are some tweaky electronic design things that also affect how the tubes sound. An important one of these is whether the amp is operating Class AB, where pairs of tubes work together to amplify the signal, or Class A, where each power tube is used to amplify the entire signal. There's a big tonal difference, response, feel, and efficiency difference between these two operating classes. A key component here in tube amplifiers is that the power tubes require a transformer to match the tube output with what the speaker wants to see. The transformer also contributes a tonal signature, saturation characteristics, and more to the overall sound. With a solid-state amp, all those tubes would be replaced with transistors. Transistors perform the same function as the tubes, making the signal louder, either in the preamp or in the power amp. There are two approaches here. One uses transistors to directly generate the tone, simply using them in place of the tubes. The other approach is where some of the murkiness comes in. Many amps that technically are solid-state, because they have no tubes, also use digital processing to emulate the function of tube components and tone, whether through modeling, profiling, convolution, IRs, or whatever other technology. Now, both these approaches can work fine. A non-modeling solid-state amp will have its own tone that may or may not be tube-like. Examples would include the Quilter line of amplifiers, the Orange Crush Pro amps like this one beside me, the Roland Jazz Chorus amps, and so on. A solid-state amp with modeling or digital processing will use computer algorithms to recreate the characteristics of tubes and transformers, and it tries to replicate the sound of a tube or possibly even a solid-state amp. I've seen modeled amps that emulate a jazz chorus, for example. All this is fine. When we're talking about tone, it's not the technology that matters, but the result. Still, the technology is what generates the tone, so we need to look at some of the differences. At their most basic, tubes take an incoming signal and make it louder using the electricity coming from the wall outlet. That's why they're known as valves in some parts of the world. Transistors do the same thing. The difference is that tubes are fairly non-linear, meaning their response and characteristics change as the signal level changes. When you push them harder and harder, tubes go gradually and smoothly into clipping, meaning they no longer accurately reproduce the signal. Our ears perceive this as distortion, and it largely consists of additional harmonic content that's added into the signal. With tubes, these harmonics are mostly even order, which tend to sound warm and full. There's also a compression characteristic where the sound gets smoother, the feel for the player gets a bit softer as well, and the notes sustain longer. It's not just a tone thing, but also a touch and feel thing for many players. With a transistor, clipping or distortion comes on more immediately, and the emphasis is on odd-order harmonics, which can have a harsher, more metallic sound. There's less of the compression effect as well, and of course you don't get that extra coloration from the transformer, which tends to be nonlinear as well, saturating more as you crank things up and tending to roll off some of the top end for a warmer tone. However, and this is important, manufacturers have made huge strides with pure solid-state designs. Modern solid-state amps, and I'm not talking about modeling here, but pure solid-state amplifiers sound much more tube-like, for lack of a better way to say it, and the feel is much more tube-like as well. When you do factor in modeling, the emulations can be stunningly realistic. So let's talk about the pluses and minuses of tubes versus solid-state. First, we have the desirable tonal qualities of the tubes: richness, dynamic response, sustain, harmonic content, gentle clipping characteristics, and so on. These have made tubes the go-to for players for decades. We also have the desirable characteristics of the transformers that tubes require: gentle saturation, warm top end, and full bottom end. On the other side of this, tubes and transformers are simply heavy and bulky. There's just no way around it. Tubes are also basically glass bottles with all the air inside removed. This makes them fragile and subject to breakage during transport. Tubes also wear out and their tone changes as they're used over weeks and months. They generally need to be replaced regularly if you're playing a lot, especially if you're pushing the amp hard. And to sound their best, many players find that tubes generally need to be cranked up, which can cause problems if the resulting volume is too loud for the situation. Solid state, on the other hand, does not require heavy transformers, and the components themselves are light and compact, meaning solid state amps generally can be made much lighter and can be made smaller as well. Transistors don't wear out or age and never need to be replaced. They're by definition solid devices, so they're durable and they don't break. Tonally, solid-state amps have made huge strides forward. They now sound and feel very tube-like. And if you do factor in the addition of modeling, convolution, profiling, and other technologies, then the emulation of tubes can be phenomenally accurate. But there are some other considerations. All other things being equal, tube amps tend to sound louder than solid-state amps. So for example, it's likely that a 50-watt solid-state amp is not going to be perceived as loud as a 50-watt tube amp. This is one of the reasons you often see much higher power ratings on solid-state amps. However, the tone of a solid-state amp doesn't change as you change the volume level. It just gets louder or softer. A tube amp, on the other hand, typically does change tone and feel as you change the volume level, and in most cases, a solid-state amp will simply be less expensive than a comparable tube amp. Another consideration is musical genre. Certain genres rely more heavily on tube characteristics. Roots rock, alt rock, and genres where semi-distorted guitar are common may work better with an appropriate tube amp. However, for clean jazz tones, solid-state is often preferable for its more consistent tone at different volumes and its clean amplification characteristics. But speaking of clean tones, either a tube or solid-state amp should be capable of clear, sparkling cleans, and either can serve very well as a pedal platform. High gain may also go either way. A player may enjoy the slightly softer touch of a high-gain tube amp, or may prefer the tighter, faster response of a high-gain solid-state amp. As a side note, you may see some tube amplifiers that have a tube rectifier, and some with a solid-state rectifier, and some where you can switch between different rectifier types. The rectifier, whether tube or solid-state, is part of the power supply in the amp, and that's the section of the amp that converts what's coming out of the wall outlet into usable voltage for the amp components. A solid-state rectifier will give a tube amp faster response and may be more desirable for high-gain tones, while a tube rectifier will generally have a softer, some say spongier feel that works well for lower-gain tones and certain styles of music. So as you can see, so much of this comes down to personal preference. What tone do you desire? What sort of touch or feel do you want the amp to have as a player? What volume are you playing at? What's your comfort level with fragile tubes and replacing tubes as needed? How much does the weight of the amp factor in for you? All these are important characteristics. Tubes versus solid state is a very complex topic, one that goes way beyond what we see at the surface. Those major secondary differences like weight, durability, and price are fairly objective and easy to vet. They either matter to you or they don't. But the primary considerations, tone and feel, are much more subjective and personal. Only you can make the call on those. Choosing the best amp for your needs can require soul-searching and serious consideration, but it's also a lot of fun as well. A great resource will be your Sweetwater sales engineer. Your sales engineer has experienced a lot of amplifiers of all types and can help you work through the many options on the market. Give them a call, and they'll be happy to discuss all the possibilities with you. Thanks for joining me today. I'm Mitch Gallagher from Sweetwater. Thanks for watching. Be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Click here for more videos like this, or start at sweetwater.com for all your music instrument and pro audio needs.